People can come to the right conclusions for the wrong reasons. I am not Christian, and I'm not a conservative, and I have very little sympathy for the Christian conservative worldview. However, for example, I am morally opposed to gambling. Don't do it. I think everyone should quit gambling. I think ideally we should make gambling illegal. Who's with me? Who agrees with me? Apparently only Christian conservatives. In fact, only a tiny minority of the most conservative Christians seem to share my view that gambling is a bad thing, that it's a bad thing for us as individuals, and it's a bad thing for society as a whole. Now, how did those Christian conservatives arrive at this conclusion? Their reasoning may indeed be bad and faulty and wrong. It may be based on supernatural assumptions about the world that I don't sympathize with in any way. However, when you're in a situation of debating politics with Christian conservatives, or when you're in a situation of debating politics with, say, left-wing extremists, socialists, and communists, it's important to keep in mind that you're not just debating their assumptions. You're not just debating the validity or invalidity of their reasoning. You're debating whether or not they might be right, even if at random, about a few conclusions here and there that they may have come to thinking their way forward from a false premise. Now, this video is not about gambling, but if we were going to discuss gambling in a sincere, constructive, productive way, obviously we couldn't just focus on the worst case scenario. We couldn't just discuss examples of catastrophes, of people's lives being ruined, of the terrible things that could happen to some minority of people through gambling. And the problem with basing your reasoning on these sorts of catastrophic examples isn't just that they're a minority of all cases. The problem really is that they're catastrophic in nature. If you interview people who have committed murder and ended up in prison and ask them, didn't you realize, didn't you know that by committing this crime you could spend the rest of your life in jail? They very often say back to you, yes, they did know that, but they thought that they would be an exception. They thought that they would get away with murder. They thought that it wouldn't happen to them. If you interview people who have become drug addicts and you ask them, weren't you aware that using this particular drug or trying this particular drug could lead to your addiction, could lead to your poverty, could lead to your homelessness or your imprisonment? They will very often say back to you, yes, they were aware, but they thought that they would be the exception. They thought that it wouldn't happen to them. So the focus on catastrophic worst case scenarios, it's problematic and misleading in many different ways, not just because it fails to represent the majority of all cases, but because we have this powerful human tendency to think of ourselves as an exception to every rule.
How's it going?
I'm Axel. Who are you?
I am Brooke Lee Adams.
Brooke Adams.
That's me.
Awesome. How old are you? God, you look so young.
I'm not quite as young as I look. I wish.
Really? You mean you're like 19?
No. Close.
Wow.
Close.
The stage name she used was Brooke Lee Adams, and as you heard there, alluded to briefly, many of the films she appeared in insinuated that she was just 18 or 19 years old, but in fact, she was 23 or 24. She was homeschooled by Christian fundamentalists, raised in what I would consider an insanely religious family. She was married at age 19. The biography of her life that is most commonly found on the internet states that she studied biochemistry at the University of Southern California, that she got an internship with the Pfizer Corporation, and she briefly had a career in infectious disease research that included traveling to Africa. This may or may not be an exaggeration. In her accounts of her own life, she repeatedly describes herself as having studied at a Christian college, and she tends to exaggerate the extent to which the quality of her education was incredibly poor. These two accounts may be reconcilable. I've certainly met people who had university degrees in the United States of America who nevertheless were incredibly poorly educated. For several years, she was one of the most famous and the most highly paid performers in the adult entertainment industry, appearing notably on the cover of Hustler magazine. By her own account, she became an alcoholic, a cocaine addict, and was deeply traumatized by her experience. However, this is not a catastrophic worst-case example.
But at the time that I was in the industry, there was a problem with people faking their tests, and there was an HIV outbreak. So that scared me, and that made me upset. And so I took a little break, and I stepped back from the industry for a few weeks, I guess it was, and my agent called me and let me know that he had an opportunity for me and the opportunity was to go be the escort of the princess for a week, and it was a very, very large sum of money. And I was doing a lot of drugs at this point, and I was drinking heavily, and I decided that this is a super good idea for my life. And so I went. I was supposed to be there for 5 days. In a strange turn of events that to this day is still kind of a mystery to me. I was, like I said, drinking a lot. I got over there and he took a real shine to me. And he asked me to stay there with him. And I told him no. It was Christmas time and I had to get back home before Christmas because I didn't want to tell my parents that I was being a hooker, you know, and so I didn't want to share that with them. So I told him no, and I don't think the prince has ever been told no by anybody before, and so he got really mad and he kidnapped me, and I stayed there for a little over 2 weeks, and the things that happened while I was there have left physical and emotional scars on my body that I will never get rid of. And in some ways I don't know exactly how I lived through it, but you do. And then I came home and I was understandably a little tweaked in the head. And so I did more cocaine and more drugs because that seems like a really good idea, and did more drinking. And by that point, I knew I wanted to leave the industry, but I didn't know how. I didn't know what I was going to do. So I just kept going to LA and kept shooting scenes until one day I overdosed on cocaine.
It's very easy to simplify the problem and to propose its solution merely in terms of the age of the participants. To say, well, it wouldn't be so bad if only these women weren't 18 years old, but had a minimum age of 19 or 20 or 21. This particular young woman, her whole career took place when she was 23 and 24. And she wasn't ignorant of how the industry works. She actually is an extraordinary example of someone who became involved in the industry very gradually by first having a job behind the camera.
You want to become a big porn star?
You know, while that's tempting, I'm considering working on perhaps more of a business, perhaps in the porn industry. We'll see.
Really?
She was a production assistant in the hardcore pornography industry. She didn't just see how the business worked on set. She saw camera work and performers and all those things going on, but she also learned about all the steps and stages involved. She learned about how the business side of things worked, the contracts and the AIDS tests, every stage, what goes into it. And she also understood how to bargain for her own position, like not just how to make more money out of performing a particular scene or a particular sex act. She understood very well how to avoid doing things she did not want to do how to complain, who she could complain to, who was working on her side, who wasn't. There were even labor unions for this stuff in California. She understood how the labor unions worked. She understood how the whole business worked because of the peculiar path she took to being involved with it herself. This is not a case in which we can say she became involved in the industry blind or ignorant as to how it worked and what was going on. On the contrary, she had a remarkable education in precisely how this industry worked before she took the step from being behind the camera to being in front of the camera. And if a university education counts for anything in this world, we can just note again that in general, this is someone who would be considered highly educated. Not only that, she had credentials and a career in the sciences, at least on paper.
And I pulled out a compact, and my lips were completely blue. I was cyanotic. And that was the beginning of the heart attack that I had. I realized at that point that my heart was stopping because I couldn't take a deep breath anymore. And man, heart attacks hurt, let me tell you. And I realized that my obituary was going to be something to the effect of like, she had a lot of promise, and then she went into porn and did some drugs and then died alone in the valley by herself. And that's not how I wanted to go out. That's not what I wanted my story to be. I have been asked by multiple people if I could go back and do it all over again, would I not be in porn? Would I not do those things? And the thing is, I would skip the heart attack, but everything else I would still experience, because it made me a different person, and it made me compassionate and kind and loving to people that I never would have met. The smartest women I have ever met in my life are hookers and whores. All of them.
This is not the worst case scenario. She began her career with extraordinary advantages over other young women, and she ended her career with extraordinary advantages also. During the brief period in which she was at the peak of her career, she was in the privileged class of the most famous, the most celebrated, the most highly paid women in the industry. It also deserves to be said, the industry itself was at its pinnacle then, before it was, so to speak, destroyed by the internet. Before she became an actress, she had a bachelor's degree in the sciences. After her dramatic departure from the industry, she got a master's degree in cognitive science. However, what career, if any, she could now have is difficult to imagine. The husband whom she married at age 19 is, in fact, still her husband to this day. They were estranged for a short time, and there are inconsistencies. If you compare the various interviews she's provided and this autobiographical account, it does seem that she likes to lie about the extent to which she was separated from her husband during her years producing pornography. The timeline doesn't quite add up, but fair enough. It's remarkable that she has managed to keep that marriage together. She is now a mother, raising at least one child. Although, obviously, she overcame her cocaine addiction, it is rather depressing to note that she never quite could overcome the faith of Christianity. I know that many people in the audience will be eager to believe that this type of career must have scarifying, life-changing psychological consequences. It's our eagerness to believe that I would just pause to question for a moment. We have an innate sense of justice that makes us want to cry out that there's no such thing as a free lunch, that you can't possibly enjoy the fame, acclaim, and wealth of having appeared on the cover of Hustler magazine, so on and so forth, without in some sense thereafter paying the price. And this is really a very cruel and childish way of thinking about the world. The truth is, not everyone deals with the same consequences. Although this particular woman has suffered psychologically, although for her there have been emotional consequences of this kind, that doesn't mean we can generalize about it. That doesn't mean we can write this up as an abstract rule on the chalkboard like a law of physics. On the contrary, it remains something very, very difficult to generalize about. As an example of the trauma or the psychological damage that she still lives with as a consequence of her career, she mentions that she cannot allow her sexual partner, she can't allow her husband, presumably, to touch her face or hair in any way during sex. If he does, even accidentally, she will suddenly collapse onto the ground, weeping, curled into a ball. She also says, interestingly, she knows why. She says, provocatively perhaps, that with sexual problems of this kind, she knows exactly what it is that she's remembering. Although it's very difficult for her to talk about, she says, she knows precisely why that is.